Good afternoon, everyone. Can everyone hear me that's online? It's just 2 o'clock now. So we're seeing people start to join the attendees. My name is Rachel Zedek. I am the director of Peterson, Thailand. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar on regenerative forestry, on financing regeneration and natural capital. It's our first webinar. Peterson hosts a lot of webinars, but this is our first in forestry. So I'm really excited about today's agenda and the companies that we're going to be talking to, because I think that these are some inspirational entrepreneurs models. These guys are doing some awesome work in Southeast Asia, and we're excited to share it with everyone who joins today. I'm going to give you guys, everyone, a brief introduction to Peterson as the host of today's webinar. I and Sai, I also want to introduce Sai. She's leading communications, so she's the one managing the presentation this afternoon. She and I will be moderating the chat box, along with Piatip. Say hi, Piatip. So Piatip leads forestry and biodiversity for Peterson in Thailand. So she will also be part of the moderation this afternoon. So very quickly, I'm going to introduce Peterson, and then I'm going to introduce our first presenter from GEA Timber in the Philippines. So Peterson and Control Union World Group was founded in 1920. We are a 100-year-old family-owned company, so we're still owned by the Peterson family. And Peterson specifically, out of the 220 different companies in the company structure, we have a mission to adapt the design, delivery, and measurement of agriculture and environmental ecosystems. So next slide. The slides are moving really slow. There we go. No, I don't think that's the right slide. So at Peterson, we have 4 technical platforms that we typically work with, which is rice. We do a lot of work in sustainable rice production in Southeast Asia. We obviously work in aquaculture, so shrimp production, not in maritime, but in shrimp, so in on land production. SME food safety. So we do a lot of work with HACCP and GMP for SME food processors and organic. So that's one reason I'm in Cambodia today, is I'm actually training myself, some farmer co-ops. And last but not least is forestry. There's a lot of buzz around talking about forestry, but the technical work that needs to be done is quite extensive in terms of regenerating Asia's forests, but also making sure that we're planting sustainable forestry as a commodity. So these are 4 of our platforms. Our priorities are values-based decision-making, transparency, financial inclusion, and innovation. So those are things that we value in terms of what we work with our clients on, what we as a company value as a family-owned company. Transparency is something that we value, because if we don't understand the problems, how do we fix them? Next. The attendees are starting to pile in. So hello to everyone who joins. If you guys haven't seen the chat box, please find the chat box. You can go down to the bottom of your screen and it says chat. And if you click on that, please introduce yourself, and please feel free to ask questions during the webinar. So the speakers today are me, for Peterson Asia, David King. David, can you wave to everyone from GEA Timber? And Brad Denick and Aiden Stretch. So Aiden, I think, is on his phone, so his camera's off, but Brad, do you want to say hi to everyone? So Brad and Aiden represent both the business and the environmentalists on the team. So it's really great to have both of them with us today. Are there any more slides, Sai? I don't think so. I know we don't need to go to the last slide, Sai. So I really want to jump into this. We're only 5 minutes in. I wanted to keep the introduction really short for everyone who's just starting to come online in the attendees box. Today's webinar is on regenerative forestry, not just on the concepts, but also on investment. Like what are the companies in Southeast Asia that are leading the charge for regenerative forestry, and what is that actually mean. We're in the Philippines. We're going to follow up with Aiden and Brad doing a tag team. I'm not sure if they're going to talk about Myanmar or Indonesia. We're going to see which country of focus they have. Each of our speakers will have 10 to 12 minutes to present what their business model is, and they can share as much detail about their financial ask as they want. We welcome, again, questions in the chat box. So David, I'm going to go on mute and poke our participants to start asking questions for the break, and take it away. You're on mute, David.
Good afternoon, everyone, however many you are. My name's David King. I'm a person who worked professionally for most of my life in development. I'm an agri-saw. In other words, an aging agriculturalist who was trained during the era of the Green Revolution, which may or may not be good from some of your perspectives. However, my experience since retirement from that position, since 2010, was living in the Philippines. We had this vast degradation of Philippine native forests, which is quite typical over much of Southeast Asia. This was done, in the Philippines case, it was done under a program of timber lease agreements, very large scale, by external companies and groups, and later on by Philippine companies and groups. But the impact, as you can see, is quite amazing. The 2% of the native forest is left in a closed canopy, in other words, old growth system. Now, the impacts of that, we all talk about it, but they're environmental, social, and economic. Can I just move some of those pictures forward? How do I move the screen forward? Sorry. There. So this is the sort of landscape you see in much of the Philippines, and surprisingly, most Filipinos assume that's always been the case. Now, my debate, we got started on this because we start planting, particularly on the grassland you see on the right-hand picture. So that's how we as GEA started. We put in our own capital, about a quite modest amount of $150,000. We set up our own clonal nursery, and away we went, working with a group of 8 in the first instance. Now, a lot of lessons were learned out of that. The first one being a lot more issues arise than you think. Second, planting trees is not like planting rice. Takes a lot more nurturing. It takes at least 2 years to ensure, when you're in grassland, that the tree can survive. But if you can get them to survive, you get very good results from year 3 onwards. And I have slides further on demonstrating that. However, in the case of the Philippines and in many parts of Southeast Asia, the issue is not what people get confused by the issues. Natural forest is often defined as, and it is, the indigenous forest and its huge range and its diverse ecosystem. That's great. But the reality is we have very little of that. If you have a forest like the Amazon, you have a very large carbon sink. And that's great. It's like a fuel tank. It's already there. It's full of fuel. And that's how it was. In the Philippines case, production forest meant that you could harvest the mature trees out of that native forest, and you ended up with, theoretically, a balance. What you harvested was equated by what was regrowing in the cycle time, which was normally 35 years. In fact, that never happened, and except in very few cases. So the trees ended up being degraded. The forest ended up with smaller and smaller species, and eventually a lot of the area got inundated by migrants coming from landless people from the lowland. So the forest ended up in quite a degraded position, which is what we see a lot of now. Plantation forest, by many of the purists, is considered a sort of a nasty outrider because it's introducing either foreign exotic trees or trees that are not part of the native environment of that area. This is true. It's a monoculture in that sense, But the fundamental issue that has always annoyed many of us of my age and experience was that you cannot, with all the altruism in the world, there is no point in planting in an area with native species if you assume that they're going to be there in 10, 20, or 30 years' time, which it takes for these trees to mature. Because as soon as they get to any sort of size, maybe 10 centimeters, they will disappear as charcoal initially. If they get bigger, they will disappear as illegally cut logs. So what happens is that the degraded forest never recovers because of the human interference. And that is the fundamental issue. And to assume that a community will be quite happily accept planting trees with no ownership of that for them, or no deal by which their livelihood or their income can be changed, is really a very strange piece of logic, because it doesn't happen. People have to live. And I just put these two pictures in place. This is the Ipoh Dam, which supplies Manila with water. It's one of the dams. On the right, that was taken 2 months ago. There's still some forest around the immediate area of the dam, but if you go back into the headwaters, you will discover that it's more like that first photo I put up. So the forest is badly degraded, and people are still in there. They're still removing timber, and nobody can change that. But the impact you can see directly. Manila has had restricted water supply simply because they cannot filter the silt load that's coming into the dam fast enough to supply potable drinking water to the city. Now, of course, that creates a lot of vocal activity, but it doesn't change the fact that you can't just change the watershed in a matter of minutes. It takes a steady plan. So we move on to what GEAR is about. You know, we're all part of a watershed. We have to deal with the communities that are there, and we have to address the many stakeholders that are involved. These theories are not new. They keep getting expounded all the time. Where we differ is that we believe the community, better than having a livelihood, should also become the owner of the forest. The old Chinese adage, he who plants the tree owns the tree, has a lot of bearing in how you deal with that whole community. And this is something that in many countries is not well accepted either by the political elite or by the managing agents. They tend to think of it as government owned and government land, and they don't necessarily agree with this. In the Philippines, in 1995, they passed a law called the IPRA law, the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act, which gave areas of land that had clear ownership by these tribal groups, extended over time with no breaks. These areas have been designated as tribal lands with a title. It's called a certificate of ancestral domain title, and it gives these people the same rights as any other Torrens title, except that it is a communal title. It is not an individual title. So the community can make decisions about what it does on that land in its own right. And this is the area we feel has a lot of potential for growth in both regenerating forest, in protecting watersheds, and in providing income for communities. And the basis under which we are operating is this. The IPRA law, in order to make it function, requires quite a bit of negotiation with a group of people who may or may not be fully conversant with some of the logic of the law, the fact that they have, that you can take a lease, and their rights, what they can get out of that. So we at GEAR spend a lot of time with the Datus and the head of the clans, because in a piece of a Kaji, there may be up to 10 clans. So they may all be of the same tribe, but they'll be separate clans. You have to deal with each clan. And you don't just deal with the clan leader, of the joint leader, you deal with each clan and then make sure that you agree on an agreed, compromised plan. And that plan we prepare with them, and both groups sign off on that, because the plan is quite critical. So we have a set of goals within that plan, the primary one being that the commercial element will be, from our perspective, the important one, but from their perspective, ancestral domain land will be important, sacred sites, agricultural land, etc. So we basically create an integrated area development plan, and it's based around their CADTI area. So where possible, we maximize the amount of indigenous forest, native forest, that can be incorporated into the plan. But the agreement from the IPs is that they will then leave that as a protected area in its own right. They will not be, there will be no human intrusion in that apart from non-forest product. So they'll be quite happy to gather honey, vines, etc., but they are not going to harvest trees. And the trees harvest will come from exactly what you see on the screen now, from some sort of fast-growing selected timber species, which will depend on the site, will be chosen and grown from a colonial source. It will not be grown from seed. If you notice these trees, they all are quite uniform. That's because they've been grown from a clone, so they've had the same mother and the vegetative reproduction. I don't want to get into the detail of that. I can if you want, some of you later on want to discuss that, but that's quite important for the sort of material we want.
David, I'm going to give you 2 more minutes because you're almost 15. I want you to focus on GEA's business model.
Okay, our business model then is to go into these people to create a business plan based around their science. The objective is to try and get 2,000 hectares of forest with a 10-year cycle. So that's 200 hectares a year for each group as a minimum. That gives us enough volume of timber in 10 years' time to run a downstream model for manufacturing, and whether it be a sawmill, whether it be a chip manufacturing plant, whether it be even wood chips for power generation. 2,000 hectares is a useful scale by which they can operate. Our objective is to get funding in order to plant that. The funding is up for a 2,000 hectare plantation is about $5 million US, and in order to establish that over 10 years. So it's not so much a big lump sum of money at the front, because we plant sequentially. So it's a matter of planting 200 hectares a year for 10 years, and then they harvest the 200 and so on. Once you've got the first cycle, that keeps on continually being harvested like a crop. So the funding is about getting that first sequence in place for the period of time it takes to get to the mature trees. And that is the large...
That $5 million is also going to help GEA properly commercialize your current operations.
Exactly, yes. So we have we have a lot of land banked area. We have a lot of groups that are willing to participate, but the issue is getting enough committed funds for the period of time that we need to get a cycle in place. If you do not get that cycle in place, then you end up with a very half-baked solution and a lot of unhappy members, and you cannot create the cycle. And the model we have that we like is that we see it's not just developing a commercial forest. It's because at the same process you develop the communities, which are, as I have stated in the rather wordy piece, they are the groups of people that have been left behind. They are minority. They have not received the same attention in terms of education, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of water supply, in terms of schools. I mean, many of these kids would walk 4 kilometers or more to school. If they
so David, realistically, so the money that you're going to need, you're not going to be asking for $5 million in one lump sum. You're likely going to need tranches of different capital to deploy that money for communities.
The initial tranche, that's right. So it's about $100,000 per hectare to establish 1 hectare of forest over the 10-year cycle. But most of that is in the planting in the first 2 years, the planting and maintenance of the first 2 years. And after that, it declines quite rapidly. But there's nursery stock and
so
then
in terms of your, so David, I know that you could talk about trees. I want to talk about you and your team. So do you guys feel as a team, GEDGE, you are ready for investments? Are you guys prepared that if an impact investor comes to you, that you'll be able to share all the documentation for a due diligence process, that
Yes.
you will be able to demonstrate the use of how you'll use their money to operationalize and also profit sharing?
Yes, we have 3 sites that we have a lot of detailed information about, and they have been signed off as far as we can go by the communities themselves. So we cannot go any further with the communities unless we can keep going talking to them, and they get a bit upset that we're not producing any money. But that's the stage we're at. So we have 3 sites. Potentially, we have about 30,000 hectares we could plant, which is probably a bit more than. I'm very strongly of the belief if we can get the first 2,000 hectares on the ground and demonstrate it, then it will be easier to make the money flow. The second point of that is that the year 4 cycle, you can actually leverage that plantation because it's in place. There are programs within the commercial banking system in the Philippines that will lend against those 4-year-old plantations to plant and expand the area. And we would be very happy to leverage like that. So we are really looking at money to get initially a core area planted so that we can demonstrate that.
And for those of you who don't understand, in the Philippines, indigenous people's lands are protected, but they also can't be used as collateral. And so that's one of the other challenges that you guys are facing in terms of raising the capital that you need. Even with those land agreements in place, you can't leverage them for commercial money.
That's correct. They cannot be used as collateral because in effect they cannot be sold. So that if anything, that's why they can't be used as collateral.
And so realistically, David, talk to me, I'm going to ask you one more question, 2 more questions, and then we are going to transfer over to Syngenera to share their model, and we're going to come back together as a group. Share a little bit about the management structure that's in place now. Tell us the strengths of that team and how you want to improve that with, if you have the investor, what are the strengths you have now and how are you going to make it better within your team?
At the moment, there are 5 of us directors who have all been involved in the same scale. What we are running is a very thin management group under us. Bit harder for me to climb up and down mountains these days, but I still do it. But no, we've got a young group of trainee foresters. We want to take people out of those indigenous communities and train them up both as forest managers and as project managers. We would like to have our nursery with forestry demonstrations and ecosystems, but that's somewhere down the road. But that's the sort of, we have to be involved directly with these communities and along with them. We're not particularly, we have had our careers, but this is really something quite important for us to establish for the long term for these communities. And I just see it as a development model. It is very important. And it's the bit that's often in the forest.
So there is a senior team. There is a senior team there to guide and to make sure that
absolutely. Yes, we all have I'm an agriculturalist, but with a forestry interest. Dr. Oscar Hendrano is a forester. Cesar Nuevo is a doctorate in forest genetics from Oxford University. He's our other director. So he does all the selection of the fast-growing exotic species that we use. And we will do the same for indigenous species once we know which species we can actually use.
So one last question, David. Let's say I write you a check today. I don't think you can absorb the $5 million yet. I think you probably need to stretch that out a little bit. But if I gave you $5 million, how many jobs are you going to create within these indigenous people's communities?
it's about 250 man-hours per hectare per planted. So we plant during the rainy season, so it's not a full-time job, but it's in the tribal groups we've worked with, we've had teams of about 20. So we had so about 60 people would be fully employed planting 200 hectares, planting and maintaining, and that.
And then new opportunities are open to that community for micro investment, for artisanal production, for forestry, for medicinal products that are coming from the same landscape.
Yes, we, for example, in the nursery, for a 2,000 hectare forest, we would employ at least 12 women, and we select the women because they are for picking and growing the seedlings. So these are quite meticulous process that we have to go through for the clonal rooting system. So from that we will end up with a number of projects downstream. I don't know what they all are.
All right, David, I'm gonna put you on mute now so I can manage, because I know that you'll talk our ear off for 3 hours about technical production and regeneration, because you are an agri-sor. That's one thing I love about you. Aiden, are you there?
Yes, I am here.
Awesome. So very quickly as backgrounds, somehow Syngenera's trajectory and my trajectory in Bangkok based, there's not that many forestry companies that speak English. You guys came across our radar in a couple of different ways, and then Brad Dunning, your colleague, and I were in a blockchain event and literally sitting at the same table and we had to meet each other. It's been a pleasure to get to learn about your model. You guys have a couple of different opportunities that you guys are incubating in both, I believe, Myanmar and Indonesia. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Aiden, to introduce yourself and your colleague, and you guys are going to tag team a little bit, I think, on the technical side, because Brad is more the environmentalist and you're more the investor. And
correct.
So we're keen to hear about what is the opportunity with Syngenera.
All right, thank you very much. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Aiden Stretch. I'm a co-founder and director of Syngenera. And my background is over 20 years in investment banking, private equity, and venture capital with an emphasis on clean tech and clean energy. So Syngenera is a natural capital asset manager with a focus on corporate buyers of ecosystem products and services aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals and the low carbon economy. So in this presentation, if you go to the next slide, on the outline, we will be talking about what are the issues that are driving, what are the problems we're trying to solve, Syngenera's solution, what we do, our initial target customer, the aviation sector, and then a couple of the initial concessions that we're targeting in Indonesia and Myanmar. We'll talk a little bit about the team, and then we'll talk about what the ask is. Next slide. So there are really three mega trends that are impacting both governments and corporations globally that I think everybody on this call probably recognizes. The first one is depletion of natural capital. And we're seeing finance and policy responses to this issue in the form of enhanced modeling of natural and social capital values, which corporations are trying to incorporate in anti-deforestation targets and natural capital protocol and social capital protocols. The second megatrend is, which we're all fully aware based on the media these days, is the greenhouse gas emissions. The finance and policy responses for this have been, going on for a long time. How effective they've been remains to be seen, but starting with the Paris Agreement, and then more recently seeing things such as green bonds and obviously the Green Climate Fund. And then on the corporate side, we're seeing science-based targets, internal carbon pricing, and carbon insetting as a response to this issue. And then finally, unsustainable and inequitable development. That was, from a policy point of view, that was one of the genesis for the Sustainable Development Goals. And as follow on from that, we're starting to see SDG bonds and impact investing. And on the corporate side, we're starting to see shared value models and SROI and SDG initiatives. Next slide. So forest conservation, reforestation, and sustainable land use are key to maintaining the 1.5 degree increase globally, and also represents, we think, an enormous opportunity. If you look at GHG emissions globally, forestry and land use change collectively represent 31% of GHG emissions, compared to 13% for global transportation. In addition, the New York Declaration on Forests estimates that 350 million hectares need to be replanted by 2030, that in order just to maintain the 2% to 2 degree pathway. Most recently, in the IPCC report, they state that in order to maintain the 1.5 degree C pathway, there'll need to be 700 million hectares of bioenergy crops or land converted to sustainable bioenergy crops. And then lastly, in terms of natural capital assets, WBCSB estimates that the natural capital asset class will be approximately $350 billion annually by the year 2030. And one of the issues we see is there's no systematic way for managing the investment inflows that are required into this sector today, and that's one of the main problems that we're trying to solve with Syngenera. Next slide. So what do we do? Natural capital asset management, what does that mean? So we acquire concessions anywhere in the range of 20,000 hectares to 200,000 hectares. Typically, these concessions have a 50-year plus term. And while initial focus is on the tropical landscapes in Southeast Asia, including both terrestrial rainforests and also mangroves. So once we have acquired the concession, we develop a sustainable landscape plan to cultivate biomass that can be in the form of forestry products, but also bioenergy, energy crops, conserve primary forests, and then innovate with the local community in many of the ways that David talked about in the previous presentation. Our products, which initially will be carbon offsets and sustainable biomass and sustainable energy crops, significantly reduce GHG emissions and are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. And then these services we provide to these products and services we provide to corporate customers, and as we talked about earlier, the initial target sector is the aviation sector, because that's the first sector that has initially voluntary but ultimately mandatory requirements or demand for both carbon offsets and sustainable jet fuel. And Brad will get into that, talk a little bit more about the aviation industry.
I'm going to ask a question just to help everyone who's listening. Define for me and define for the audience listening, what is natural capital?
So natural capital is, we define natural capital as the concession area that we use to produce ecosystem products and services. So by whatever means of intervention that is required, and that varies by concession. So in some concessions we've seen it can be as much as 80% conservation, where the majority of the products that will be produced will be in the form of carbon offsets. And it can be the opposite, where 80% of the land has been degraded and needs to be either reforested or recultivated with bioenergy crops, and those become the predominant products from that natural capital asset. So on the next slide, I'm going to hand it over to Brad to step in and talk a little bit about the use of technology and also the aviation industry.
So the second piece of what we do is around utilizing big data and then also plans for blockchain. So around big data, again, the scale of the problem for greenhouse gas emissions, deforestation, and SDG-focused sustainable development, we need better data. Both the capital that wants to deploy needs better data, and I think the corporates that want to go into their value chain to create more value, they will need better data. So we want to integrate multiple data sets using satellite real-time GIS data. And we want to augment that with data on the ground around social impacts, what natural capital is available, and really seek to maximize the the best blend, optimize the best blend of natural, social, and financial capitals from concession. So again, we see on the second point there that this data-driven analysis can be helpful to institutional capital, again, to allocate resources to those concessions with the richest social, environmental, financial impacts. And then lastly, all of the insights will be layered upon the Sustainable Development Goals. So we have 17 goals, roughly 140 targets, because each goal has many targets embedded within it. And then there are numerous metrics for each target within a goal, right? So how do we actually verify contributions to a particular target under a goal? So all of that is part of this big data analysis. So then we look at the bottom of the slide. So what are the kind of services and revenues that we see generated from this? One is data solutions for institutional capital. Second is consulting service with corporate customers utilizing this data. And then the third part is, what are the benefits from blockchain? What are the use cases for this? And that's greater transparency really around certification, any certifications of our products, then also any claims around these SDG benefits can be tracked, monitored through blockchain. Next slide, please. Yeah, and I'll just go very quickly through this. Again, a key focus for us is the SDGs, and the big data platform that will take advantage of this is called Sync, right? So this is the platform that brings together the data, has a blockchain, works with both institutional capital and corporates to evaluate all of the social, natural, financial capital revenue streams through SDG lens. Next slide, please. And yeah, just the very last one on this Sync technology. And this gives you how we see it within the overall framework of the company. So on the very left, you have some concessions, beta concessions. And then on the bottom of the slide, those are the three core products, if you will. There's another non-wood forest products or ecosystem services, not fully represented here. But again, from the concession, we have RED+ carbon credits, biofuel feedstock, and then in one of the concessions in particular, there's the opportunity for animal and fish feed. The target industry is aviation, but there's others in power, F&B, even chemical materials industries are potential off-takers, but again, our focus is aviation. Then on the top is we basically, through all of our products and services, want to be monitoring the specific contribution to a particular target within a goal. So if goal 7 is clean energy and 7.3 will be a specific measurement of that, and we can use different metrics, we can talk about how this concession contributes to that target. Likewise with, say, SDG 8, meaningful work, we'll also have certain metrics around each of the targets within that of how we are contributing to this and how our corporate customers can also see their contribution to SDGs through the platform. Okay, next slide. So why aviation? The international aviation industry, I mean, it's struggled in the EU to be part of emissions trading scheme there. And this is the first global emissions trading scheme for a particular industry and sector. And that makes sense given where the emissions occur for aviation. They're not contained within a jurisdiction. So this is underway. There are reporting requirements currently for airlines. CORSIA will really kick off in 2021, and then 2025, 2026 is where the real compliance will heavily begin. But just to give a sense of the scale of how important CORSIA is in aviation, let's go to goal 2 and 3. Starting in 2020, it's carbon neutral growth. And then in goal 3, by 2050, it's to achieve basically 50% of what emissions are in 2005. You are only going to get those kind of reducplus from massive increase in the use of sustainable aviation jet fuel. There's going to be purchase of carbon offsets. We believe RED+ will be part of that. And there's other efficiencies, but you are certainly going to need 2 of the core products of Syngenera, carbon offsets, and aviation biofuel. Next slide, and I think this goes back over to Aiden.
All right, thanks, Brad. I know we're running out of time here, so I'm not going to sort of walk through all of the points on in each of these slides in the essence of time. But if you can see from this slide, it just really echoes the point that Brad previously made about the huge future demand for sustainable jet fuel. And obviously there'll be a need for sustainably certified feedstock in order to feedstock for that end product. And that's one of the main products we'll be targeting. Next slide. And Brad, actually, I think you were going to cover this slide, Brad. Sorry to switch back to you. The next two.
Sure, no problem. And I know we're short on time, so
yeah.
Again, this is kind of the overview of the company right here. Right, is on the bottom you have your three core products. In the center is really the products and the service strategy consultation with aviation customers. On the left is the team. You know, what makes it unique is that there are the team has both forestry expertise, finance, corporate sustainability. It's that blend that kind of helps us to see, you know, what this market opportunity is. And then on the right, aviation customers. Again, the drive through Corsia makes it pretty clear what they're going to need, and having this, you know, more or less one-stop shop that kind of provides a lot of their needs, and also through an enlightened kind of SDG, the understanding of their corporate sustainability drivers will be a differentiator in our opinion.
So Brad, we've had a really specific question for you guys, which is from Tiro Racina, and she says, monetizing SDGs, we have, you know, and in quotations, we have certain metrics. I've mentioned in the chat box to reference GRI, Global Reporting Initiative, which also uses the SDGs in all 176 metrics to support commercial reporting. But can you just touch a little bit more, coming from the scientific background, of the exact metrics that you're aligning to? You mentioned some of them, but we've had a very specific question to that.
Yes, I'd say I'd like to take monetizing off the table for a moment and just focus on the metrics piece, which is, you know, for any one of those targets, right? And it could be around meaningful work. It could be around indigenous land rights under 15, under goal 15, and land protection, biodiversity. For each one of them, there's already a document generated by, I believe it's PwC, that for each target gives us acceptable metrics that we can use, right? So if you're saying that the goal is to, you know, increase by 50% the amount of land that's protected, let's say for indigenous, then there's going to be clear metrics of what's the base versus what's an acceptable base year, baseline, versus mitigation efforts that are put into place, and then capturing the result. So I think the metrics they're actually fairly clear about how to track a particular target under an SDG. The monetizing is further afield. I think that's you know, several years away. At this point, we need corporates and capital to be more comfortable with not just saying we're aligned with SDGs and we put, you know, a nice pretty logo next to business as usual, but to actually dig into each one of these and start contributing. And that's why those metrics are important.
But I think it's an important, you know, there's been more than 13,000 firms that have now initiated GRI reporting, which is the framework for the SDGs. But, you know, there's a concern that we're defaulting to a new reporting standard to replace, you know, if that's business as usual, is that real impact, or is it just another report of metrics? So I think it's good that you clarified that a little bit.
Okay. Should we move on? Okay. Next one, please. And Aiden, do you want me to continue here, and then I'll
yeah, I'll take the next slide. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So then this is both Sync and Syngenera's overview of a sustainable aviation industry, from sustainable biomass, the feedstock, we would present for jet fuel, to premium forestry carbon offsets, to ecosystem products and services. Probably don't have time at this moment to go into the full vision of that for the aviation industry, but SDG aligned development and through a blockchain big data framework.
So we're targeting to have 1 million hectares of mangrove and tropical rainforest concessions by 2025, which is the year that carbon offsetting becomes mandatory under CORSIA. Initially, we're looking at 100,000 hectare tropical rainforest concession in Indonesia and a 60,000 hectare mangrove concession in Myanmar. Just quickly on the two concessions, the Indonesian concession we think will generate 600,000 tons of carbon offset per year, improve climate adaptation by 30%, avoided deforestation of around 40,000 hectares, reducing poverty for about 10,000 people, and about 60,000 tons of sustainable biofuel feedstock. And then for the Myanmar concession, it's about 1 million tons of carbon offset per year, improvement of climate adaptation by 20%, avoided deforestation of 11,000 hectares, improving the livelihoods of 15,000, population of 15,000, and production of 30,000 tons of sustainable biomass feedstock per year. Next slide. So by 2025, if we are able to achieve our objective, we expect to generate over 5 million tons of carbon offsets per year and 1 million tons of biomass for sustainable fuel. Next slide. In terms of the expertise required to do this, we have got a number of partners. Sorry, next slide. We have a number of partners in the areas of expertise that we would need to be successful. We are partnered with South Pole for carbon certification. We're using and also with Vera to use the new standards. We have an agreement with Block Apps to help with the development of the blockchain platform. Atemari is an Indonesian-based forestry consulting firm that we are working with. GGGI is working with us for the concession in Myanmar, and as well as Infraco Asia in terms of development funding for the concession in Myanmar. And then finally, we have a preliminary letter of interest from FMO to provide a debt facility to invest directly into the concessions. Next slide. The team, so this is the team, as Brad had mentioned earlier. I won't go into everybody's background, but it's a mixture of both forestry, finance, and bioenergy and corporate sustainability expertise. Next slide. So in terms of where we stand, we are currently looking to do a bridge funding round to our seed round of about $300,000 and you'll see the use of proceeds on the right. We were recently accepted into an incubator program, but unfortunately we can't disclose who that is due to confidentiality issues, but we're happy to do so in further conversations. So that incubator, we think, will give us the launch pad to start the business. But in addition to working with that incubator, we do need about $300,000 of capital to get things started, and targeting a seed financing round of 2 to 3 million. And that would allow us to basically complete the development and acquisition of the first concession, as well as the sync application, and bring on board the first beta customer from the aviation industry. Next slide. And this is sort of a timeline of what we expect to happen over the next year and a half or so with the bridge and seed financing. First goal is to develop the minimum viable product. The second is to focus on both customers and concessions for the product. The third is to enter into the agreements that we need, definitive agreements, towards the end of next year. And then with that, we expect we could close our Series A, which would be the first investment into the first concession in Q2 of 2020. and the demand for the carbon offsets from the aviation industry on a voluntary basis starts in 2021. And if that's the last for that, I think we're finished.
No, Aiden, that was great. You did run over, but so did David. It was also really interesting. I want to open up some questions. We have a bunch of questions coming in from the chat room, but I want to start with something which is pretty straightforward for those people who aren't involved in the forestry sector or an Asian investment. But knowing that there's this potential boom of $350 billion natural capital markets and assets, why, and we're talking about climate change. We know we need to plant more trees. We know we need to plant more trees to get to the 2-degree mark. We've just seen the newest IPCC report, which talks about the devastation that is looming over all of us if we're not going to make these investments. Why is it so hard to find money to plant forests? Why has it been so difficult? And I'm not trying to put you in that box that it's been that difficult, but that early stage money, why, David and Aiden, do you guys think that's been so difficult? Where is the capital?
Well, I just think it's a sector, so I'll just jump in quickly because I know I don't have much time. I think it's a sector that there's not really a lot of experience investing in, and there's not a lot of precedent for successful investment cases. And I think, as David pointed out, there's been an awful lot of failures. So I would say that's probably a couple of reasons why you're not seeing this early stage capital come into this sector. But David, you may have other things to add.
David, you're not on mute. You're on mute. There you go.
Okay. Sorry. No, I agree. I'm actually quite impressed with the way Adrian's program has been put together. Much more comprehensive than ours in a way. I feel like we are the agri-source sitting on a forestry model. They have begun much more into the carbon society model, and I think we both have the same objective. But we've started from different points. But my experience is that whenever you talk about this sort of investment, everybody says, oh, you've got to wait 8 years for the first return. And they all turn away and say, no, I can do that by investing in a health program, etc. I can get my money back in 3 years. So there's a sort of commercial driver under there, which I'm very surprised about. The development model seems to be very low priority.
And I think that's a very good point you make, David. It is that long investment gestation cycle that I think a lot of people shy away from, and that's why what we've tried to do is target concessions that either have carbon, because that's a more immediate revenue, but also have either standing biomass that's already been cultivated and or the potential for energy crops, which have a much shorter investment cash cycle than traditional forestry.
I mean, the term and tenure of all the funds that we're seeing in general, there's just so much risk aversion to natural forestry, let alone some of the indigenous varieties, David, that are 20, 25 years, like teak to maturity, even if they're under drip. The money really is not moving yet. So I was curious to hear what your guys' perception is, especially coming into this market. You both do have very similar models. You've taken, as you said, David, different approaches. But touching on carbon, there's a question of the term premium forest carbon price. Does it really mean higher income shared with the local community and the indigenous peoples? And how do you ensure that profit sharing, David? Because you guys very specifically have a focus on working with IP. I think Brad and Aiden, that isn't as clear in your presentation. You are definitely more carbon focused. So David, can you pick that question up?
Yes.
How does carbon price translate to the indigenous peoples?
Because the product is being sold on a commercial basis, and the sales will be directly through the indigenous community. It'll be there will be a management structure under which that will be shared. And the proceeds are actually theirs to decide what they do with. But our surveys have all indicated health, no surprises, health, schools, education, roads, all of the priority of those communities. That's almost universal, always the top three. But it's to
and Aiden, what about you?
And you sell it through them.
You're talking even about much larger concessions from day one. So obviously human beings or some communities are living in proximity of those land concessions and landscapes. What is the plan to engage them and to ensure transparency and ensure livelihoods?
See, I'm going to hand over to Brad to answer the first on the premium carbon offsets, because I think there's a little bit more to say about that, and also the second question. Brad, did you want to?
As far as, premium, I mean, when we look at RED Plus and also the certifications we want there, it's also going to be for biodiversity. What are all the co-benefits aside from just carbon? We like the gold standard model, and that now mandates that you have to incorporate the SDGs into carbon offsetting, right? So it's looking at all of these other co-benefits when you preserve or sequester carbon. How does it actually benefit the local community, and how do you quantify it, which is really key to what we're trying to do. So that's, to me, the piece around the premium forest carbon offset. The other thing too is, depending on the airline and how they, again, going to our key customer, how they may want to position their working with Syngenera. Here is a concession where our feedstock comes from, where they also produce that sustainably, while at the same time with primary forest managing that for carbon offsets. So we get our offsets from the same supplier, and they use this SDG lens to constantly seek out opportunities to innovate with the local community to create products. Those products can be sold to the airline and branded in a way that then that airline can say to its customers, this kind of, from land to the brand is one of the models of Syngenera, of this kind of whole sustainability angle will really help them. And that's why we look at, forestry carbon offsets from a premium lens than perhaps, let's say, a CDM or just a cheap commodity price.
And do you want to touch on, in terms of ensuring participation and transparency, sharing the benefits, creating shared value, however we want to position this with local communities? Is it just about, I'm a little reluctant to sign on board to artisanal product development in terms of, because, micro enterprise, we've seen a lot of those approaches in terms of economic development and stability fail in these communities. And the first ones to go back into the forest and cut it down. And that comes back to a point that David started with. Mm-hmm. So in terms of when we start to talk about some of the bigger figures on returns, we didn't stress either of you guys on potential returns or IRR or any of the other financial metrics. But how do you as a company, how do you guys, both of you then, for example, in terms of your own governance, plan to ensure that that creating shared value, that shared value is there for you? Because you are both at a stage where probably an impact investor and family funds, I think, could be very interested in both of you, but obviously their lens versus an A round, an A series, and a more institutional investor, they will be looking for different metrics. So maybe if you can talk a little bit about the shared value, but it also really may not be in your target spot to be focusing on those kinds of monies to care so much.
If I could just say one comment, we have an area in Aurora, 27,000 hectares of forest, which has not changed one step for the last 20 years. You would expect the carbon sequestration to be going up because but theoretically it's not being touched, but it is being touched because it's not changing, and we've measured this over the last 10 years. So what the point is that the ADSP, the Integrated Area Development Plan, signed off by all of us and the parties, that is the monitoring tool that all of these criteria must be included in that, and I'm quite happy for anybody to take that as a monitoring tool and compare it. I'd be very happy for anybody to take that, because we are very sure that is the only, transparency is the only way to make it work.
Yeah, we would agree with David. I mean, that's a similar approach that we would take, and it depends on, country by country too, because the way that the government expects benefit sharing to be structured, it varies from countries to country. So it's a little bit different in Myanmar versus Indonesia and so forth. But generally, would be philosophically, we're in agreement with you, and it's probably a little bit different also in the Philippines.
So let's talk about data, Brad, because I think that's a great topic to talk about. Big data, you know, I'm a big fan of big data. I think that it is the single metric for me in terms of us bringing more transparency and impact, and you know, creating that value for multiple stakeholders, whether it be for our investor or whether it be for the local community. So I want you to share a little bit more. What is the big vision on the data, and how were you guys driven from becoming a forestry incubator? Sustainability, all of these ecosystem services that you're offering, for example, one of your off-takers like the aviation industry, how does data become now the selling point? Because I really think this is a critical part of the business plan, and I think that it's actually going to be something that's going to help you raise money faster than a lot of the other companies that are probably still struggling.
Yeah, and I mean, the way we look at it, right, is in how we divide it up here in the presentation is there's the asset management, the actual management of the concession, and then the data lens on top of that.
Yes.
How we also envision this too is that they will be reinforcing of each other in the knowledge, right? So we'll start with the data that we would apply to a concession as far as determinative of where we think the best opportunities will be. And again, our core revenues are around biomass and carbon, and then all of the other kinds of innovations augment. That's where they might succeed, to your point earlier around social entrepreneurship, is we don't lead with that, they augment these other heavy business models that would be more sustaining. So the data looks at those of how do we maximize, how do we actually increase, if you will, the opportunity cost of land, converting it to, let's say, agricultural or other uses, and we want to stack biomass and carbon. We want to use the data to then also say, what are the actual benefits of climate adaptation? How do we actually quantify that? And can we get an investor or others that will actually see the value in that as part of our stacked set of values that give us an equal or greater opportunity cost to alternatives to develop a concession? So that's one of the...
Talking about that. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Brad.
So that's one of the views in the applications of the data. At the same time, and why we call them beta concessions, will be what are the learnings that we are going to get from applying this model onto different concessions in a way we're not just looking at one or two. Again, we have the two core revenue streams, but we also want to experiment and understand if these ecosystem services, biodiversity in the past have been kind of broken pieces where we haven't really quantified them financially of their benefit. Can we do that through all of the SDGs, all of the 17 goals, all of the targets, begin to actually start to quantify the benefits of contributing to those so that we start to augment higher and higher stacked values than just a biomass plantation? That's the intent.
And to be frank, data will also offer us two things. It will also offer us transparency where there could be negative impact, even if it's not intentional, but that can come from a business model. And I also think it's about predictive analytics. It's being able to say into the future, these are the opportunities and this is the actions that we need to take at a landscape level.
Yes.
And I want to come back full circle though, guys, and I want to give you both a chance to tell me and to tell everyone who's listening, we are going to record this. We will be promoting that recording as an investor pitch. So who do you guys think, and Aiden, this might be a better question for you, and David, I don't know that you may have an answer for this yet. I hope we've inspired you today in terms of the presentation for an investor. Who would be your ideal investor? Who do you each think as a team would fit well, not only in the mission statement of what you're trying to do, but in the patience that will likely be needed and in involving themselves in these type of investments? These are all big vision and long term. So what's the best match for you? You guys have any answers you want to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think from our perspective, and I'll let Brad comment on this too, I think it's somebody who shares the vision that in order to mobilize the amount of capital that's required into this sector, you know, over the next 2 decades, there needs to be a more systematic, scientific way to do that. And that just doesn't exist today. It's completely ad hoc and it's very inefficient. And that's really, I think, if you want to boil everything down to its essence, that's what we're really about. And somebody has the same vision as we do in that regard. Brad, did you have anything?
So big picture, risk adverse, and wants to play in probably some of the most challenging forestry concessions in the world.
Yeah, well, it's having a framework of decision making that allows you to manage those risks. I think is one of the byproducts of what we're trying to do.
Aiden, I love what you guys are doing. I'm just, as an entrepreneur, I have also failed to raise money. I have raised money. I would love nothing more than there be a free pot for all the guys like you who are out there doing, who are walking your talk. It's just really challenging. And so that's why I'm really happy that we're profiling your work, because I think that if more businesses like you and GEA can finance through these bridge rounds, I think that it will inspire more entrepreneurs to reach, to be able to finance, because you guys will become some of the first doing this really cutting edge innovative work, and it'd be data-driven, science-driven. So we're doing some of the same stuff in Rice, and it's not science-driven. It's all sort of anecdotal sustainability, which doesn't really mean very much. So David, what's your answer? Who's the dream investor? Who do you guys think is a match for the model that you have available in the culture of your company?
I originally thought, I really feel like the agrisaur now, because after listening to Adrian and the broad scope that he's covering, I'm actually, we're quite traditional in that sense, where we're focusing on a product, on land that is trying to restore land to some semblance of what it was. So I've tended to think that some of the countries that have large forestry industries, and I'm thinking of the Scandinavian countries, they were always the one that understood the length of time that it took to get that sort of model in place. Yeah. But once you have the forest, everybody forgets that it took that long, or you didn't destroy it in the first place. So they understand that. But I've been through this escalator many times. So you get people expressing interest, but then backing out. And that just keeps on happening. So that's where I would have thought they might have come. A cedar type operation, which would have acknowledged the need to get forestry established.
Aiden, I really want to pick your brain a little bit more with your background on the carbon markets. Do you believe that they're going to be offering credible returns for investors over there? And can you talk maybe then also about the term and tenure of that opportunity within your model? Because we talk a lot to clients and investors about voluntary carbon, and we're incubating projects that are equally insane, trying to figure out how we structure them and how to make them the most attractive for an investor. So from your guys' experience and what you're doing and really deep diving into the carbon strategy, I think everyone would like to hear a little bit more about that.
I think that's a question that Brad is eminently more qualified to answer than me.
I have a feeling you both are.
Sorry, your question is really around.
Well, it's really about voluntary carbon markets. It's like, is carbon, because we've seen the voluntary carbon markets not perform. They've not delivered on expectations. So you guys obviously have put a lot of thought into this. So I would love to get your insights on how you think the voluntary carbon markets are going to support and how they're going to mature and when and how.
Sure.
Because a lot of people are looking at voluntary carbon as the justification for investments, the driver.
Yes, first thing I'd say is just the Corsia will be not so much voluntary, but compliance driven for the aviation industry, just to clarify. But other things that we see are science-based targets. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative is growing pretty rapidly. And for most companies, if you want to develop and get an approved science-based target, and your scope 3 emissions are greater than 40% of the total, you have to have a target there. And they may decide to offset that through the purchase of carbon offsets, or they may decide to inset it themselves, right? To like L'Oreal, Nestle, a bunch of others, that Starbucks that work with the value chain to reduce emissions, but not actually certify them.
Yep.
The other kind of last bit there is just, if you look at what prices companies are using, it's no longer uncommon to work with a company that looks at $50 to $100 a ton, that's actually doing M&A due diligence, saying, okay, we're looking at different scenarios, and prices at 2030 for OECD countries are $100 a ton. So that is very, very common in your larger multinationals, is to price in much higher carbon prices than what we see right now. So yeah, that's just to kind of say I see the market and the prices that we need to have much higher, and I think I'm fairly confident in companies will gravitate towards that.
And we've all seen even Wall Street Journal and Forbes have recently, in terms of economic modeling, saying we need to see the prices go up in order to justify all the investment that is needed in order to reach the carbon targets that we need for global warming. I'm going to hand this over to Pietit because she has some questions, and I want her to come off mute about compliance and compliance as a tool and biodiversity. So Pietit, do you want to ask some of your questions? Because I'm only a little concerned about my internet and if I drop off, so I'd like you to take over and wrap up maybe some of the more traditional questions, David, because we talk a lot about the use of FSC, forestry management tools, compliance tools. Brad, you've mentioned them during your presentation as well, in terms of giving maybe from a perspective of either creating shared value, from quality assurance for product development, for sustainability metrics. So there's lots of different ways to touch on compliance. Brad, you just touched on them. So Pietit, do you want to ask a specific question? And I'm going to let you lead this now.
Okay. In fact, my question is go to David, because the IP, as he mentioned that the IP already have that got the certificate, got the concession on the land ownership, whether it would link directly to the standard, the legalities of those standards, yeah, either it's FSC or PFC. So in the Philippines has already recognized the IP land as legalities, right?
Yes, that it's a legal entity, and I think it's one of the few countries in Asia that's done that.
And that is also including the natural forest cover?
Whatever cover is on that land, it belongs to the IP community, yes.
And if it overlaps with the national parks or the protected area, whether it's also belonging to the IP?
Yes, that's an issue that we haven't encountered. Everywhere we've done CADT has not overlapped with the national park to date, but I'm sure that is possible and that will happen. But our argument is that if, remember, IAD, Integrated Area Development, we're a smaller scale of what Adrian was talking about, but any indigenous forest that's there and is going to be rehabilitated by natural regeneration will increase its carbon content, and that must be measured as part of the process. That's one of the outcomes that must be.
Okay, thanks.
But I would face the issue about overlapping ownership when it happened, and I'm sure it will happen. But at some point, there will be a government issue about whether there should be a tax or a payment made to government for this. I don't know, but I assume that.
Okay. How?
At the moment, there is no. At the moment, the government doesn't seem to offer any option either in managing what they have. So it's not on the agenda. One other comment I'd make is that further to what Rachel was saying, I would have thought some of the high emitters might have been good partners or contributing. It's very difficult to see it happening, but coal-fired power plant operators, for example, discussions with them that I've had have not been very fruitful, and yet they are the main source of energy being developed in the Philippines over the next 20 years, which I find. So there's no attempt to correlate Paris agreements with current energy requirements, which I find difficult to manage.
Yeah.
For us.
So Pietit, just a heads up, because my screen keeps freezing. So if I log off, I want you to carry on. I want to just take a moment to thank everyone for joining us for at least the first 90% of the webinar today. And we can keep asking questions. There are chat room questions that are still coming in to either the speakers or everyone. So I also want to give everyone a chance now, David and Aiden or Brad, up to you, a chance to talk about your challenges and to talk about beyond the money, beyond needing to raise the capital that you need. What are some of the other challenges that you as an organization? I mentioned that because Aiden or Brad mentioned, for example, becoming involved in a new incubator. So are there other opportunities that you as companies or groups are seeking beyond just finance? And I think that would be great to document, because we have a network, but we also know the network that's involved here. We want to be able to help companies like you connect. And I think part of the SDGs, Brad, just to touch on something, because Peterson aligns all of its work to the SDGs. And one of the SDGs, and we went over that slide very quickly, but is SDG 17. So that's about collaboration for the goals, partnership for the goals. We are not going to reach the goals alone. So if you guys would like to talk maybe a little bit more broadly and not just about the financial perspective, but what are the other relationships that you as companies or as teams would find valuable to help you continue to implement your mission statement?
Okay.
Because I think there's lots of organizations that have lots of resources that may help you still continue to push the needle forward as you continue to hunt for the next round of funding.
In fact, I also have the questions towards both David and also Brad, that when you work in the Asian country or Asia country, how would you see also the mechanism of the government of those countries that supporting this kind of a new initiative from your companies? Because this is also the thing that was a big gaps, that the forestry department or the forest state, the one who working on the forestry, they are not knowing or maybe not comfortable enough to on the blockchain and the big data, as well as the carbon trade. Yeah. So, and they are not really comfortable to making their regulation to available this kind of business yet. How would you see them? How would you see the mechanism or the government sector that can support you?
So just one comment from the Syngenera side is having partners and engagements with like a GGGI are very, they have mandates of helping governments around, low carbon transitions.
Oh yeah. Okay.
And so those are the type of folks that can really kind of drive policy discussion. Another partnership with South Pole Group. Yeah. They also kind of have an ability to help us out in that regard, because as an upstart, with other commitments too, it's very difficult to have the capacity to do all the things that I'm trying to do, right? So like you say, on the blockchain side, on carbon, on agroforestry, sustainable forest management plans, there's so many parts to the business model that we're often strapped for resources first. So partnership, to simplify it, partnership's the main thing. The other aspect, going back to Rachel's question, is and I guess Syngenera will find out in the near future how much of a help it is, but incubator programs and accelerators. So if we think back to what helped Silicon Valley, right? And it's very difficult to get a seed or bridge round for an e-commerce company. So many, technology accelerators. Where are the accelerators for clean tech and sustainable land use? I think there are some, but there probably needs to be more. And I think there will be more, given how much heightened focus there is around SDGs by 2030 and 1.5 degrees. There's not a lot of time left. So there will need to be literally a lot of accelerators to make this happen.
Yeah. And David, do you have any comment?
Well, first of all, I agree that you can't do it alone. And one of my feelings now is the inadequacy we have as the small group we are. So the partnerships with the native tree enthusiasts, many groups are active in the field, but not coordinated in any sense. So they're all doing their own thing. And my situation in the Philippines is, first of all, I'm not Filipino. So many of the relationships with the government agencies has to be done by a national. that requires, again, coordination at those levels. So I see very little coordination, or up till now, there's been little coordination between the three government agencies which are involved: Environment, Climate Change Commission,
Yeah.
and Energy Commission. None of them actually have any. They run three separate silos. So there's not even a basis to begin any coordination at that level, let alone with us or our other groups that are very active. So again, I come back to the IAD, where you have an integrated area and you're dealing with a group of people wanting to enhance the native forest and so on. You can bring them all in and work at that level. Trying to get at the government level has proven quite difficult for us. I don't know how Syngenta manage it, but on a larger scale, I guess it's possible. But for us, that hasn't been it's been fine with the forestry, and the IPs, but it's much more when you're trying to get a policy change, which is what we need to have at this point.
Yeah, I do agree. Let me also ask the attendees, are there any other questions I didn't see any of them yet. Yeah. So maybe the participants can also raise their questions. Right now it's your turn, you know? Yeah, I doesn't see anyone yet. Yeah. So anyhow, from my experiences in Thailand, the forestry and that kind of the carbon trading, we have a lot of rumors or the thing that was just a talk, and we are preparing the RED, for example, REDD, and it's only the pilot projects, and we cannot really make the calculation of the carbon. We try to MRV it, right? Yeah, to make it verifiable and also reportable, and then we don't have the market. So that is also the lesson that in at least in Thailand. And once we have been talking about the blockchain, we also thought that it would be too expensive for us to invest in the forest carbon. So that is also the thing that when I learned from Brad and also Adrian, that would kind of the thing that we need to learn more and also try to introduce to the forestry people and the policy makers in particular to be ready for, and also to somehow learn and develop that kind of mechanism to have that kind of big data available. So,
big data is very, very, very important. That's what I see for all of us. And, you know, what data we collect from drones and so on these days is a big change, but it's still very small beer compared to the overall environment that we're dealing with. And quite frankly, I think Philippines is similar. The government is not yet focused on any of those sort of criteria. So it really becomes, as you've said, it becomes pilot issues rather than reality on the ground. And so that, in a way, explains why our approach has been much more pragmatic than and using the framework we have to demonstrate. So we've taken it the other way. We'll put it on the ground and people will come. That's our belief. But that's in some ways, saying that the planning is not as intense, or as the data collection is not as broad. And that is true. But then as the scale goes up, of course, the data will become available. But I agree with all of the speakers. Big data is going to be very, very important.
Yeah, and someone...
The only way you can actually get a basis to understand what's really going on.
Yeah.
But trying to get a forestry, even to get a forest registered, is quite difficult here, and very expensive. It's actually not worth. It costs money to actually do it, so we haven't done it because to actually get it certified by one of the UN FCC agencies is quite expensive.
It is.
And I would suggest that some of the bureaucracy has got out of kilter with some of the reality that can be done. And there are programs around that can be done by local communities and verified by local communities, not to the same degree, but it's conservative, so it underestimates, but at least it's replicatable. So you can do it every year and see what the changes are. And I would much rather have that sort of model than trying to be accurate to the nth degree. That's another discussion and another battle.
Okay, start small. It's nice.
Start small is what we do. Relatively, 2008.
Yeah. Okay.
That's
Okay.
how
Yeah. Brad and also Adrian, do you prefer to leave? Do you like to do some? Do you like to make any comment or the last word before you leave? Maybe they left. Okay. Anyway, because he also mentioned that.
I'm sorry. Yeah, I was on mute. I mean, I had to get into a taxi. So no, I think it's been very, very fruitful conversation. So thank you for organising it. I didn't have anything else to add at this point.
Mm-hmm.
Aidan, I'm very impressed with the scale of your model and rather envious of what you have attempted, to be honest. And I wish you well.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, we should definitely talk offline, David, because we also have been looking at some concessions in the Philippines. So it'd be great to talk to you about those.
Well, I'd be very happy to do that. So we can do that through. I guess we can do that through Peterson and get addresses, and then we'll be in touch.
Sure.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay. On behalf of Peterson, we thanks to all the speakers and in particular to those attendees who also stay with us till the end of the webinar. So looking forward to talk to you more in the future, and we plan to have much more fruitful discussion in terms of how can we increase our forestry to make the world better. Okay. Have a good day. And
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much.
Have a good day.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.